The man known to history as Alexander Hamilton was born in Charlestown, the capital of the island of Nevis, in the British Leeward Islands, which now forms part of the island nation of St. Kitts and Nevis. Although his birthday was the 11th of January, the year of his birth remains the subject of some historical debate. And while as an adult, Hamilton claimed to have been born in 1757, several documents from his childhood suggest that he was actually born in 1755. His father, James Hamilton, was born around 1718, the fourth son of a Scottish landowner, the Laird of Grange in Ayrshire, and in 1741 he travelled across the Atlantic to St. Kitts, hoping to make his fortune in the sugar business. In the 18th century, the Caribbean islands, including Nevis, were the home of sugar plantations generating vast amounts of wealth for the European colonial powers. The venture proved unsuccessful for James, and he had to be bailed out by his brothers and family friends back home in Scotland. As his parents were unmarried at the time of his birth, Hamilton had a difficult childhood and was always reluctant to discuss his upbringing in later life. Hamilton's mother was Rachel Falcuet, the daughter of a French Huguenot physician and an Englishwoman. Born in Nevis around 1729, she'd moved to the Danish island of St. Croix with her mother, where she married a Danish man named Johann Michael Lavien at the age of 16. Although they had a son together named Peter, the marriage was an unhappy one, and by 1750, Rachel had left her husband, who responded by having her imprisoned for adultery. After her release, she fled St. Croix, leaving her husband and son behind without obtaining a divorce. In the early 1750s, Rachel Lavien would meet James Hamilton in St. Kitts. She was a young woman around 10 years his junior, who at the time remained married to her estranged husband. Despite this legal impediment, the couple would live together as James and Rachel Hamilton for around 15 years, during which time Rachel gave birth to two children, James Jr. and Alexander. Alexander Hamilton was therefore born into the layer of West Indian society below that of the plantation owners and slaveholders, but above the slaves. However, as an illegitimate child, he was denied the formal schooling provided by the Church of England and would have to receive lessons privately, while his mother may have taught him to speak French fluently. On Nevis, he witnessed the cruel nature of a slaveholding society, with public whippings and slave auctions commonplace. The ordeal of a slave working on sugar plantations was particularly hard, and 3 out of every 5 slaves died within 5 years of their arrival from Africa. In February 1759, Johann Lavien finally decided to request a divorce from Rachel, but the terms of the separation were such that he was free to remarry, but she could not. In 1765, Rachel returned to St. Croix, while James was carrying out some business on behalf of his brother in Glasgow, but after this was accomplished in January 1766, he abandoned his family forever. The reasons behind this are unclear, but Alexander later suggested that his father had run out of money to support them, though some say he wanted to spare Rachel the indignity of being charged with bigamy. Rachel made a living as a shopkeeper in Christiansted, while hiring out the 5 slaves she inherited from her mother. Living above the shop, Alexander had access to a library of 34 books, and although no record of them survives, the poetry of Alexander Pope, Plutarch's Lives, and Machiavelli's The Prince were among the earliest literary inspirations for the young Hamilton. At this time, he received tuition from a private school run by a Jewish headmistress. Further tragedy would follow the family on the 19th of February 1768, when Rachel died from a fever that Alexander also contracted and almost succumbed to. Rachel's meager inheritance passed to Peter Lavien, her sole legitimate son, leaving Alexander and his brother James penniless. They were transferred to the care of their 32-year-old cousin Peter Lytton, only for him to commit suicide in July 1769 without mentioning them in his will. Following Peter's death, the two Hamilton brothers were separated for good. James was apprenticed to an old carpenter, while Alexander worked as a clerk for the trading firm Cartwright & Kruger and moved in with the family of the merchant Thomas Stevens. He became particularly close to Edward Stevens, one of the 5 children in the family, and the two teenagers did not only share similar interests, but an extraordinary physical resemblance. This has prompted rumors that Alexander was the illegitimate son not of James Hamilton, but of Thomas Stevens. This might explain why James Hamilton Sr. abandoned the family so abruptly in 1766, and also might account for the distance Alexander chose to keep with his father and brother later in life. As a merchant's clerk, Hamilton learned how to manage money, convert currencies, and keep track of the ships making their perilous journey across the sea, carrying all sorts of commodities for the plantation economy. The young clerk's talent for organization and management was clear, and when Nicholas Kruger returned home to New York for health reasons in late 1771, the 16-year-old Hamilton was left in charge of the operation for 5 months. Once a year, Cartwright & Kruger would also become involved in the transport of slaves for sale at auction, and over time this became an increasingly significant part of the business. The slave population on St. Croix doubled in a decade, which increased the risk of runaway slaves and slave insurrections. Every man over the age of 16 was to serve in the island's militia, which was established to keep an eye on the slave population and prevent slave revolts. The teenage Hamilton was also a talented writer and wrote poetry for the Royal Danish American Gazette. In 1772, Hamilton met Hugh Knox, a liberal Presbyterian minister who allowed the young man to use his library and encouraged him in his literary exploits. After a devastating hurricane struck St. Croix on the 30th of August 1772, Knox persuaded Hamilton to publish a letter, which he had sent to his father, describing the impact of the storm. A group of businessmen on the island was so impressed by the evocative letter that they pooled funds to send its author to North America for a formal education. After arriving in New York during the winter of 1772, Hamilton began his studies at Elizabethtown Academy in New Jersey, a preparatory school on the grounds of a Presbyterian church, where he took courses in Latin, Greek, and mathematics. Being ambitious and always looking to get ahead in life, Hamilton left Elizabethtown within 6 months, hoping to get into Princeton College, but his request to embark on a fast-track course of studies was refused, and he instead went to King's College in New York, present-day Columbia University. When he began his studies in early 1774, Hamilton received private studies without belonging to any class. Although he hoped to be a doctor, Hamilton read widely and became as familiar with the writings of classical antiquity as he did with the Enlightenment philosophy of thinkers such as John Locke, David Hume, and Montesquieu. Hamilton arrived in North America during a period when political tensions were gradually increasing between the 13 British colonies in North America and the authorities in London. In 1763, Britain defeated France in the French and Indian War and conquered Canada, and in order to pay for the defense of their North American territories, the British government sought to raise taxes on the colonies. This inspired opposition from the colonists, who demanded political representation in the British Parliament as subjects of the British Empire, dividing American society between the patriots who resisted Parliament's demands and the loyalists who wished to remain on good terms with London. The most notorious piece of taxation was the Stamp Act of 1765, but despite being repealed the following year, Parliament continued to assert the right to tax the colonies. In 1767, the Townshend Acts, named after the British Chancellor of the Exchequer at the time, levied duties on paint, lead, glass, paper, and tea. In response to the threat of a boycott of British trade in retaliation, Parliament repealed all the taxes except the one on tea in 1769. Although tensions temporarily calmed, on the 16th of December 1773, the patriot organization Sons of Liberty staged what has become known as the Boston Tea Party, boarding a ship belonging to the British East India Company and throwing its precious cargo of tea overboard. By May 1774, the British responded by closing down the port of Boston and increasing its military garrison in the city. The British response to the Boston Tea Party prompted the colonies to convene a Continental Congress in Philadelphia to organize a boycott of British trade. Although New York had a large population that remained loyal to the British Empire and benefited from a close economic relationship from London, there was no shortage of patriots. At a meeting of the New York Sons of Liberty branch in 1774, the 19-year-old Hamilton astonished the crowd with an electrifying speech defending the Boston Tea Party, promoting colonial unity, and endorsing a boycott, which he argued will prove the salvation of North America and her liberties. Hamilton's radicalism placed him at odds with Dr. Miles Cooper, the president of King's College, who was one of the most ardent loyalists in New York. But this did not prevent him from championing the Patriot cause in a couple of anonymous pamphlets that argued that the Patriots enjoyed political rights given to them by God, which Parliament could not take away. Like many Patriots, Hamilton's dispute was with Parliament rather than King George III, but he welcomed the prospect of a limited monarchy. Although Britain was a powerful imperial power, Hamilton suggested that the economic potential of the American colonies was far greater than that of the mother country. He was not afraid of war with the British, and argued that it would be almost impossible for the British to subdue the Americans if they adopted irregular tactics and refused to meet the enemy in pitched battle. On the 18th of April 1775, the first shots of the American Revolutionary War rang out at Concord and Lexington in Massachusetts, where patriotic militiamen forced the British redcoats to flee back to Boston. When the news reached New York, volunteer companies sprang up and armed themselves with weapons seized from the City Hall arsenal, and Hamilton himself joined a militia company and dedicated himself to learning about military tactics. On the 10th of May, hundreds of protesters stormed King's College, intent on lynching the hated Miles Cooper. Alerted to their imminent approach, Hamilton managed to hold the mob at bay for several minutes to allow Cooper to escape out of his window and onto a ship which carried him to England. This episode reflected Hamilton's anxiety that revolutionary fervor might get out of control and lead to anarchy. As a politician and statesman, Hamilton would spend his life trying to find the right balance between liberty from oppression and the maintenance of political order. On the same day that Cooper made his narrow escape, the Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, serving as a forum to strengthen cooperation between the colonies to more effectively wage war against the British. George Washington of Virginia was appointed as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army on the 15th of June, and a couple of days later, the Patriots in Boston demonstrated they were capable of providing strong resistance to the British at the misnamed Battle of Bunker Hill, with the majority of combat taking place on Breed's Hill nearby. By 1776, Hamilton was intensively studying law, but in April, Patriot forces commandeered the college and used it as a hospital. In March, Hamilton dedicated himself to the war effort by being appointed captain of an artillery company in the militia, where he eventually had 68 men under his command. He proved an effective officer and leader, and lobbied hard for his men to receive the same provisions as their counterparts in the Continental Army. His talents were soon recognized by senior officers in the Continental Army, including Nathaniel Greene, whom Washington considered his most talented subordinate. After the Continentals captured Boston in March 1776, Washington rushed to New York anticipating a British assault. In June, a force of 32,000 men and 70 warships gathered under the command of the brothers General William Howe and Admiral Richard Howe. As the Howe brothers planned their attack on the 2nd of July, delegates at the Continental Congress adopted a resolution written by Thomas Jefferson of Virginia calling for the independence of the 13 United States of America, which was passed in its final form on the 4th of July. Hamilton, due to his age, lack of experience, and lack of social status, was not qualified to be a member of the Congress, and so missed out on signing the crucial document. The words of the Declaration of Independence had a galvanizing effect on the defenders of the city. On the 12th of July, Hamilton's company was stationed at the battery in direct line of fire of 2 British warships. As the company fired its guns, one of the cannons exploded and killed up to 6 men, though its captain was not blamed for the incident and emerged with his military reputation enhanced. On the 26th of August, a force of 6,000 Continentals, left isolated on Brooklyn Heights, was soundly defeated by the British, but the damage was limited by a daring night retreat carried out by Washington on the 29th. As the Continentals marched up the Hudson River out of the city in September, Hamilton's company was part of the rear guard, which resisted Howe's men and sheltered Washington's main force as it retreated to the Harlem Heights. It was here that Washington met Hamilton for the first time and received his first impression of the artillery captain's talent. In late November, Washington was forced to withdraw to New Jersey, and once again, Hamilton distinguished himself by covering the retreat across the Raritan River. Although seriously ill, he roused himself to take part in Washington's daring crossing of the Delaware on the night after Christmas to surprise the garrison of Hessian mercenaries at Trenton, where the fire from Hamilton's guns helped to force the surrender of almost 1,000 Hessians. At the Battle of Princeton on the 3rd of June, Hamilton is said to have deployed his cannon in the grounds of the college, sending a cannonball through the portrait of King George II in the chapel. These Continental victories gave Washington's depleted army the opportunity to recover at winter quarters in Morristown, New Jersey. Hamilton joined Washington at the camp on the 1st of March and was appointed to his staff as aide-de-camp with the rank of lieutenant colonel. Although Hamilton expressed some disappointment at being given a desk job, this was the start of a fruitful partnership which would lead the two men from the battlefield to the halls of government. Although he was a prosperous landowner and an experienced politician, Washington was not as articulate as many of the most prominent American political leaders of the day. As commander-in-chief, he had to deal with a large volume of correspondence with Congress and the individual states, and Hamilton soon applied his organizational skills to managing this workload on Washington's behalf. As de facto chief of staff, he channeled the commander's thoughts into orders and letters and was soon allowed to issue orders with Washington's authority in his own name. The fact that an illegitimate immigrant could achieve such heights at the age of 22 was a reflection of the American meritocracy that Hamilton would forever remain grateful for. As Washington was the closest thing the Patriot cause had to a political leader, Hamilton was also exposed to political debates in Congress. While Washington pleaded for increased supplies for his army, the representatives of the 13 states continued to squabble amongst each other and promote the interests of their own states at the expense of unity. In 1777, Hamilton was joined on Washington's staff by 2 men who would become his closest companions during the war. John Lawrence was a few months older than Hamilton and was the son of Henry Lawrence, a wealthy South Carolina politician who became president of the Continental Congress in November 1777. As a teenager, Lawrence went to school in Geneva and studied law in England, and after he returned to North America to take part in the Revolutionary struggle, he proved Hamilton's equal in intellect and ambition. In July, they were joined by the Marquis de Lafayette, a 19-year-old French nobleman who joined the American cause motivated by both a genuine commitment to the cause of liberty and a youthful desire for military glory. In late July, Howe's army left New York and headed towards Philadelphia, the Continental capital. Although Hamilton was eager to do battle with the British, Washington was soundly defeated at Brandywine Creek on the 11th of September. While carrying a mission to destroy flour mills on the Schuylkill River, Hamilton's boat came under attack, and he was forced to swim to safety. Anticipating an imminent British attack, he informed Congress, whose members fled the city and reconvened in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. While Howe delayed his attack on the American capital, Hamilton was given the delicate task of requisitioning supplies from the city to bolster Washington's dwindling supplies while preventing them from falling into the hands of the British. By setting his sights on Pennsylvania, Howe had missed the opportunity to cut off the American colonies in two by coordinating operations with General John Burgoyne in the north. In July, Burgoyne had captured Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York and was marching southwards to link up with Howe. However, Burgoyne was left isolated by Howe's operations against Philadelphia, and on the 7th of October, he and his 5,700 men surrendered to General Horatio Gates at Saratoga. The battle proved a turning point in the war and prompted France to recognize American independence and join a military alliance in February 1778. With the North more secure, Washington dispatched Hamilton to request reinforcements from Gates. After covering 300 miles in 5 days, Hamilton used his diplomatic skills to persuade the hero of the hour to give Washington 2 of the 3 brigades asked of him. Using his own initiative, he also managed to convince General Israel Putnam to send 2 of his brigades to Washington. The mission took a heavy toll on Hamilton's health, and it was only in January 1778 that he rejoined Washington at winter quarters in Valley Forge. At Valley Forge, Hamilton witnessed an army that was poorly armed, poorly fed, and poorly clothed. In early 1778, a Prussian officer named Baron Friedrich von Steuben arrived at Washington's headquarters. The Prussian army was considered the most effective and disciplined in Europe, attributes that Washington's men sorely lacked. Owing to his poor command of English, the Baron usually spoke French and relied on Hamilton and Lawrence as interpreters. Within weeks, Steuben drilled the men to march in formation, load muskets, and fix bayonets, and soon revised the army's drill manual, with Hamilton acting as translator and editor. Upon receiving news that a French fleet was sailing across the Atlantic to join up with the Continental Army, the new British commander Sir Henry Clinton decided to withdraw his 8,000 men from Philadelphia to New York, and Washington chose to pounce on the retreating enemy. After General Charles Lee mishandled the attack at Monmouth Courthouse on the 28th of June, Hamilton watched with admiration as Washington calmly restored order. Hamilton himself halted a retreating infantry brigade and organized a bayonet charge and was badly injured when his horse was shot from underneath him. Hamilton arrested Lee for insubordination and gave damning evidence at his court-martial, which found the general guilty on all counts and suspended him from the army for a year. When a French fleet under Admiral Jean-Baptiste d'Estaing arrived in July 1778, Hamilton once again served as interpreter on behalf of the monolingual Washington. The Frenchmen were impressed by Hamilton's talent and military knowledge, but while Hamilton never understated the French contribution to the patriotic cause, he considered the French army to be full of mediocrities who owed their positions to nobility rather than ability. In addition to the French alliance, Hamilton hoped to bolster the ranks of the Continental Army with soldiers from the black population. In late 1778, the British landed an army in the south, where the population was generally more sympathetic to the Loyalist cause. John Lawrence resigned from Washington's staff in order to defend his native South Carolina, and Hamilton wrote a letter to Congress supporting Lawrence's plans to raise up to 3,000 black soldiers, arguing that they were just as brave and willing to fight as white men, especially if they were offered their freedom. Congress was unable to override the objections of the South Carolina planters, and instead it was General Clinton who promised to free runaway slaves who joined the British in June 1779. At the end of 1779, Washington took up winter quarters in Morristown, where the army had stayed 3 years earlier. Despite poor weather and low supplies, Hamilton found comfort in an active social life, courting several pretty ladies as he went. On the 2nd of February 1780, Elizabeth Schuyler, the daughter of General Philip Schuyler, arrived in Morristown to join some relatives. Although it was not the first time the two met, Hamilton was infatuated and by the end of March the pair had agreed to marry. Not only was Eliza a strong-willed and compassionate woman who provided stability to her husband's turbulent life, but her family was one of the wealthiest in the state of New York. Hamilton delighted in the company of Eliza's 4 sisters, in particular Angelica, whose vivacious nature appealed to Hamilton's gallantry. Far from feeling threatened, Eliza was delighted that her sister was equally fond of her husband. While he was courting Eliza, Hamilton was also turning his mind to the economic crisis facing the United States. He argued that while a shortage of goods had contributed to inflation and the corresponding decline in the value of the continental dollar, it was exacerbated several times by a lack of confidence in paper money. He suggested creating a central bank which could issue money and make loans, and argued that in order to address the lack of credit, Congress should seek a foreign loan of £2 million. Later that year, Hamilton was under consideration to join Benjamin Franklin in Paris to negotiate such a loan from France, but eventually the appointment fell to his friend Lawrence. On the military front, the Continentals were faring no better in South Carolina, as a British army under General Cornwallis captured the American garrison at Charleston and soundly defeated General Gates at the Battle of Camden in August. In response to these setbacks, Hamilton wrote about the need for a greater centralization of power. Although Congress had adopted the Articles of Confederation, which would eventually come into effect in March 1781, Hamilton believed that these measures did not give the central government enough authority to carry out the war effectively. Matters were generally decided by unwieldy committees, rather than dedicated ministers for war, foreign affairs, finance, and the navy. During the summer of 1780, Hamilton was extensively involved in planning joint operations with the Comte de Rochambeau, whose army of some 5,000 Frenchmen had landed in Newport, Rhode Island in July. In September, while returning from a meeting with Rochambeau in the company of Washington and Lafayette, Hamilton was a witness to the treachery of Benedict Arnold, a talented general of the Continental Army who felt that his exploits were not duly rewarded by Washington and promised to surrender the fort of West Point to the British. In November, he was granted leave to visit the Schuylers in Albany, and on the 14th of December 1780, Alexander Hamilton and Elizabeth Schuyler were married at the Schuyler Mansion. After almost 4 years serving on Washington's staff, Hamilton longed for a field command, but was repeatedly refused. For the commander-in-chief, Hamilton was too valuable an asset to lose, but now that he was connected to the Schuylers, he was no longer solely dependent on Washington's patronage. After informing Washington of his intention to leave his staff in February, Hamilton carried out his final duties as a staff officer in March 1781. This did not prevent him from pestering Washington for his desired field command, which was finally granted in July after Hamilton threatened to resign from the army. While Hamilton took command of a New York Light Infantry battalion, the Schuyler house in Albany was raided by the British on the 7th of August, seeking to kidnap prominent Americans, but the pregnant Eliza and the rest of her family managed to escape unharmed. Although Washington had planned on laying siege to New York City, news that the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse was headed for Chesapeake Bay prompted the American commander to lead his men to meet with de Grasse and jointly lay siege to General Charles Cornwallis, who was trapped in Yorktown in Virginia and surrounded by water on 3 sides, with a Continental army under Lafayette sealing off the 4th on land. After being reunited with Lafayette and Lawrence in late September, Hamilton prepared to play his part at the siege of Yorktown. Cornwallis had built 10 redoubts around the town to bolster his defenses, and Hamilton saw that the 2 outlying redoubts closest to the besieging forces would have to be taken. The Allied siege lines could not be completed without taking these 2 positions, and on the 14th of October, Washington decided to storm the redoubts with bayonet charges. In a gesture to the Franco-American alliance, he decided that the French and the Continentals should each take one of the redoubts. After some argument, Hamilton was given command of the column of Continentals, who charged ferociously and took the position within 10 minutes. After losing both redoubts, Cornwallis realized that further resistance was futile and surrendered on the 17th of October, 1781. Hamilton hurried to Albany to join Eliza, who in January 1782 gave birth to a son named Philip, the first of 8 children the couple would have. Hamilton resigned from the army in March as the war was all but over, apart from minor skirmishes in the south, one of which would claim the life of John Lawrence in August, leaving Hamilton devastated. Upon his return to New York, Hamilton resumed his legal studies and passed the bar exam within 6 months. In November 1782, he went to Philadelphia to take up his seat as a member of the Confederation Congress representing New York. He continued to believe in a powerful central government with a standing army and navy for the United States, as well as giving Congress greater powers over taxation. He found a willing ally in the form of James Madison, a 31-year-old congressman from Virginia, and supported Madison's proposal for a 5% federal duty on imports, thus giving Congress the power of taxation. The poor government finances were of a particular concern for Hamilton, knowing that many veterans of the Revolution were still waiting for their pay. On the 20th of June 1783, a mob of mutinous soldiers surrounded the Pennsylvania State House where Congress was meeting. Despite Hamilton's best efforts on behalf of Congress to force the state government to call up the militia, Congress withdrew to Princeton and eventually found a more permanent home in New York in 1785. The incident further reinforced Hamilton's belief that the central government was not powerful enough, and he called for a convention to revise the Articles of Confederation. Many political leaders held the opposite view, and after the United States and Great Britain ratified the Treaty of Paris on the 3rd of September 1783 to end the war, Thomas Jefferson suggested that Congress should be disbanded. In late 1783, Hamilton and his wife moved into a house on Wall Street, where he would spend the next few years practicing law and soon developed a reputation as one of the leading lawyers in the country. Hamilton's reputation in New York was rivaled by another young lawyer named Aaron Burr. While Hamilton's oratory was unsurpassed, Burr made concise and convincing arguments to the court. During the war, New York passed a wave of legislation targeting British sympathizers and their property, but after the peace treaty signed with Britain, Hamilton defended the rights of the Loyalists in court and in the press. Although this led to accusations of treachery and claims that Hamilton had accepted British money, his defense of the Loyalists was motivated by both the belief that an independent United States had to behave respectably on the international stage, and also the fear that the vindictive campaign would drive out wealthy merchants and businessmen and damage New York's prosperity. In the case of Rutgers versus Waddington from 1784, Hamilton successfully argued that the obligations to protect British property that were part of an international treaty ratified by Congress superseded New York state legislation that allowed for its confiscation. In June 1784, Hamilton played an instrumental role in founding the Bank of New York, which was intended to revive commerce in the city after the war and to issue its own money in an economy that still used British pounds and was trading in other foreign currencies with inconsistent exchange rates. During this time, Hamilton was heavily involved in the New York Manumission Society, an organization campaigning to abolish slavery and to promote the education of free blacks. He was also a member of the Society of Cincinnati, an organization dedicated to the welfare of veteran soldiers, which critics argued was the breeding ground for a hereditary military aristocracy. Hamilton denied these claims, but hoped that the society would serve as a further means of strengthening the Union. In April 1786, Hamilton was elected to the New York State Assembly during an economic crisis. In September, he was one of 2 New York representatives who attended a conference in Annapolis, Maryland, organized by James Madison. Although the conference was set up to resolve problems concerning interstate trade, it served as an opportunity for supporters of greater centralization to discuss their ideas. the delegates decided to send an appeal to the states to send delegates to a convention in Philadelphia the following May to amend the Articles of Confederation. The state of New York, dominated by its governor George Clinton, was a staunch defender of states' rights, and when choosing its delegation to the Philadelphia Convention, the New York Assembly appointed two opponents of centralization to accompany Hamilton to the meeting. The Philadelphia Convention opened on the 25th of May 1787, and George Washington was unanimously elected its president. Although it was convened to revise the Articles of Confederation, the delegates soon presented plans to discard the Articles and create a new constitution. The convention was soon split between a proposal from Virginia to allocate congressional representation proportionally, benefiting larger states, and one from New Jersey to give each state one vote, benefiting smaller states. After 3 weeks of silence, as the delegates discussed the rival proposals, Hamilton presented his own plan, which envisaged a president and Senate elected for life, albeit subject to removal for misbehavior, and a House of Representatives elected every 3 years. The proposal was, however, proved unacceptable, and Hamilton's critics later used it as evidence of his belief in monarchy and aristocracy, and labeled him as a traitor to the Revolution. Instead, the convention agreed a compromise between the larger and smaller states by having the seats of the House of Representatives allocated proportionally, while each state would be represented by 2 senators in the Senate. Senators would serve 6-year terms, while representatives would be subject to re-election every 2 years. A president could theoretically serve for life, but would have to face election every 4 years, while the justices of the Supreme Court were appointed for life. The other major dispute splitting the convention was how to count the population of black slaves in determining representation in the House. By counting slaves, even though they had no political rights, the slaveholding states, mostly in the South, would receive greater representation in Congress. In the end, the notorious 3/5 compromise was agreed, whereupon each slave was considered 3/5 of a free white man. Although Hamilton was dissatisfied with parts of the new Constitution, he was a member of the committee that revised the text and transformed it into its final form. The Constitution was signed on the 17th of September 1787 by 39 delegates from 12 states, including Hamilton, and the convention decided that the new document would come into effect after being ratified by 9 states. Within days, the United States was split between the Federalists who supported the new Constitution and the Anti-Federalists who opposed the centralization of power. Hamilton conceived an ambitious project to promote the new Constitution and ensure that as many Federalists as possible were elected to New York's ratifying convention. He invited 4 men to collaborate on the project, but only Madison and fellow New Yorker John Jay accepted. Writing under the pseudonym Publius, over 7 months the 3 men wrote 600 pages worth of essays for the New York press, collectively known as the Federalist Papers. Of the 85 essays, 51 are attributed to Hamilton, 29 to Madison, and only 5 to Jay, whose contribution was limited by illness. While Madison's strengths were in the presenting of the theory of government and using examples from history, Hamilton employed his practical experience in areas such as politics, war, and taxation. He argued that a loose confederation risked the anti-federalists' worst fears of falling under tyrannical rule or foreign invasion, and thus the United States required a strong military, which was in turn dependent on an equally strong economy and a strong government. By the end of May 1788, 8 states had ratified the Constitution, leaving the document on the verge of adoption. Despite his efforts to influence the elections to the New York Convention, Hamilton and his fellow Federalists were significantly outnumbered when it met in June, chaired by Governor Clinton. By the end of the month, however, both New Hampshire and Virginia had ratified the Constitution, and New York now faced being left behind by the new federal entity alongside Rhode Island and North Carolina. This alone was not enough to swing opinion to the Federalist camp, but by late July, around a dozen anti-Federalists were sufficiently persuaded by Hamilton's arguments to vote in favor of ratification. On the 26th of July, New York voted to ratify the Constitution by a margin of 30 to 27, and Hamilton was feted as the hero of the hour in New York City. The often vicious nature of the political debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists convinced Hamilton of the need for a president who could unite the country. With some persuasion from Hamilton, George Washington agreed to be a candidate and was elected unanimously, and on the 30th of April 1789, he was inaugurated President of the United States in New York, with John Adams of Massachusetts as Vice President. Although the Constitution provided for a powerful executive, its terms were vague and made no provision for cabinet government. Washington could not be expected to carry out all the executive functions alone, and in September, Hamilton was appointed to head the new Treasury Department. By accepting the post, he was giving up his lucrative legal practice and taking on a job of particular political sensitivity, especially as the Revolution had been sparked by disputes over taxation. Nevertheless, Hamilton was intent on using his office to implement his vision of America's economic and political system. Hamilton served in Washington's cabinet alongside Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of War Henry Knox, and Attorney General Edmund Randolph. As Washington shared Hamilton's desire to strengthen the bonds between the 13 states into a single American nation, but also wanted to appear as a unifying figure above the political fray, Hamilton became an unofficial prime minister under the first president. Upon taking on the role of the Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton had to carry out mundane but urgent tasks, such as setting up accounting systems and creating a customs service to collect the import duties that generated most of government revenue. His most important task, however, was to come up with a solution to America's public debt of $79 million. In his report on public credit presented to Congress in January 1790, Hamilton argued that the United States must demonstrate its trustworthiness in debt markets by repaying the debt owed to domestic and foreign creditors. During the war, Congress had issued bonds to veterans in lieu of pay, and many sold their holdings at steep discounts to speculators due to the lack of faith in Congress's ability to repay them. With Hamilton's promise to pay the debt, the speculators would be handsomely rewarded while the veterans would lose out. Hamilton nevertheless decided that the government securities belonged to the buyers rather than the original owners, on the principle that the government should not interfere in private property. He also proposed having the federal government assume state debt, which would transfer bondholders' loyalty to the federal rather than state governments. Since this system of economic management was clearly inspired by the British and envisaged the further expansion of federal power, it had many opponents. James Madison, who was at the time representing Virginia in the House, rejected the debt plan on the grounds that the original holders of the debt deserved to be paid and had been forced to sell by desperation. Hamilton viewed Madison's opposition as a betrayal of all they had worked for, and their disagreement would lay the foundations for the two-party system. For the next 5 years, Hamilton's economic program served as the dividing line for American politics. By the spring of 1790, Thomas Jefferson emerged as the leading opponent to Hamilton's grand visions. After serving for 5 years as minister to France, Jefferson returned to the United States in November 1789 and did not accept his appointment as Washington's Secretary of State until February 1790. During his time in Paris, Jefferson was radicalized in his opposition to monarchy and aristocracy and witnessed the initial stages of the French Revolution. When he arrived in New York to join Washington's administration, he was shocked at the implications of Hamilton's economic program and joined Madison in opposing it, claiming that it would aggrandize capitalist speculators at the expense of honest patriots. Thus, Jefferson and Madison presented themselves as defenders of the common man in opposition to the so-called Northern aristocracy, despite the fact that they depended on the support of slaveholding states in the South. While Hamilton's proposal for the public debt was comfortably passed by Congress, Jefferson and Madison joined forces against Hamilton's plans to assume state debts, which was defeated in the House by a margin of 2 votes. In order to salvage his economic plan, Hamilton sought a compromise in the other major issue dividing North and South, namely the location of the capital city. While Hamilton hoped that the capital would remain in New York, at least on a temporary basis, there were also proposals to relocate to Philadelphia, while Washington, Jefferson, and Madison favored a location on the Potomac River near their native Virginia. During a dinner at Jefferson's house on the 20th of June, Hamilton agreed to support a capital on the Potomac in return for an undertaking from Madison to allow the passage of the Assumption Bill in the House. Hamilton's part in brokering the deal angered many of his fellow New Yorkers, but the Assumption Bill was passed in July and kept Hamilton's economic program on track. As part of the compromise, in late 1790, the government moved to Philadelphia for 10 years, while the new capital was being built. In December 1790, Hamilton proposed to establish a central bank, which could issue a uniform currency, expand the money supply when required, issue loans to public and private entities, collect revenues and hold government funds. Hamilton argued that a central bank would stimulate commerce by issuing loans, but the Jeffersonians were skeptical and viewed them as institutions which benefited northern merchants at the expense of southern farmers. In the House, Madison argued that the proposal was unconstitutional because the Constitution did not have a provision for setting up a central bank, reversing his liberal interpretation in the Federalist Papers. After the House passed the bill, Madison asked Washington to veto the bank, prompting the president to consult his cabinet. After Jefferson and Randolph raised their objections, Hamilton presented to Washington a steadfast defense of his interpretation of the Constitution, arguing that the bank was constitutional, as Congress had the power to pass legislation deemed necessary and proper to carry out its duties, and any other interpretation would paralyze the operations of the federal government. Washington was persuaded by Hamilton's arguments and signed the bank bill on the 25th of February, 1791. In December 1791, Hamilton presented his Report on Manufactures to Congress. Drawing on his experiences during the Revolutionary War, Hamilton believed that the United States had to establish its own industrial capacity and reduce its dependence on British trade. Inspired by Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, he argued that manufacturing would increase economic productivity through the division of labor into small specialized tasks. While he endorsed the principle of free markets and free trade, Hamilton concluded that government intervention was necessary to encourage industrial development in a young nation. To achieve these goals, he proposed awarding subsidies and extending patent protection to stimulate innovation. He also advocated public infrastructure programs of roads and canals to connect regional markets into a national economy. Although Hamilton's ideas were not implemented by Congress, they further contributed to his image as a creature of the New York financiers and the enemy of the common man. Hamilton's critics felt vindicated when a speculative bubble in bank shares and government securities burst in the spring of 1792, but the Treasury Secretary calmly responded by buying up public debt at the distressed prices and, in so doing, stabilized the market. Although the Founding Fathers of the United States considered political parties destructive and polarizing, by 1792 American political opinion was effectively divided into 2 parties with rival agendas. Hamilton and his supporters, mostly from the commercial Northeast, came to be known as Federalists, implying that their opponents did not support the Constitution. Jefferson and Madison's followers, who were mostly farmers in the South, called themselves Republicans, implying that their opponents were not true Republicans. The party split also influenced foreign policy, with the Federalists favoring closer political and economic relations with Britain, while the Republicans preferred to side with revolutionary France. Since the United States had fought Britain for independence allied to France, the Republicans believed that seeking closer relations with the British was treachery. On the other hand, the Federalists warned that the Republicans supported the anarchy and bloodshed of the French Revolution. Since the federal government's revenues were dependent on customs duties raised from international trade, Hamilton maintained an interest in foreign relations which Jefferson resented as head of the State Department. The bitter feud between Hamilton and Jefferson was all over the press, with Jeffersonians labeling the Treasury Secretary a monarchist and the Hamiltonians attacking the Secretary of State as a populist rabble-rouser. Despite being the most controversial man in American politics, Hamilton was careless enough to conduct a year-long affair with Maria Reynolds, a young woman who arrived at his house in the summer of 1791, seeking refuge from an abusive husband. In December, Maria's husband James informed the Treasury Secretary that he knew about the affair and blackmailed Hamilton into paying hush money. Although he attempted to end the affair on several occasions, Hamilton was unable to resist responding to anguished letters from Maria, suggesting that she was part of the blackmail scheme. When James Reynolds claimed to his friend Jacob Clingman that Hamilton had given him money to speculate in government securities, Clingman informed Republican Congressman Frederick Muhlenberg, who in turn called on Senator James Monroe and Representative Abraham Venable to investigate. When the three men met Hamilton in December 1792, the Treasury Secretary denied any corruption, but confessed frankly to his adultery. Although he extracted a promise that the affair would remain secret, Hamilton knew that his political opponents could leak information that would destroy his reputation. Washington's second term as president, which began in March 1793, was dominated by foreign policy questions. In September 1792, the revolutionary government arrested King Louis XVI and proclaimed a republic. After the king was executed by guillotine in January 1793, Great Britain declared war on the 1st of February. While both Hamilton and Jefferson agreed that the United States should declare neutrality between Britain and France, Jefferson did not wish to break the alliance signed with France in 1778. Arguing that France had signed the alliance motivated by a desire to defeat Britain, Hamilton endorsed a foreign policy motivated by self-interest rather than sentiment. When the French ambassador Edmond-Charles Genet arrived in the United States in the spring of 1793, the Federalists were alarmed by his popular reception. Genet had been trying to recruit Americans to join the French privateers attacking British shipping, and when asked to stop, he threatened to appeal over Washington's head to the American people. When Hamilton leaked details of Genet's conduct to the press, Jefferson was forced to request his recall. However, as the radical Jacobins had taken power in Paris that June, Hamilton asked Washington to grant the moderate Genet asylum in the United States, sparing him from the executioner's blade. Following the Genet affair, Jefferson resigned as Secretary of State on the 31st of December 1793 and was succeeded by Edmund Randolph. While the Genet affair shifted opinion against France, the British practice of searching neutral ships and forcing American sailors into the Royal Navy caused greater outrage. Senior Federalists hoped to send an envoy to Britain to resolve outstanding differences. Hamilton recommended John Jay for the mission, drawing up instructions to settle the present differences with London and to seek a trading relationship on a most favoured nation basis. Jay set sail in May 1794, and by the time he returned 12 months later, Hamilton had already resigned from the Treasury in January. While the Jay Treaty secured minor concessions from the British, Republicans were outraged by the fact that nothing was done about the seizure of American ships, and while Jay had agreed to grant most favoured nation status to British imports, the British refused to do so in return. When a hesitant Washington asked Hamilton for advice, Hamilton criticised some of the articles but endorsed it as the means to avoid a destructive war with Great Britain, and the President duly signed off on the treaty in August. Although Hamilton spent most of his time working as a lawyer for high-profile clients in New York, he continued to influence national politics when asked for advice by Washington and members of his cabinet. In 1796, Washington decided he would not stand for a third term and asked Hamilton to draft a farewell address, which would establish a convention for presidents to relinquish the office after 2 terms. Published on the 19th of September, the text serves simultaneously as a timeless assertion of American unity and independence, as well as an attack on the Republican position on the key issues of the day. Despite his key role in Washington's government, Hamilton decided not to stand as a candidate in the subsequent election, perhaps acknowledging he was too divisive, or that perhaps the Reynolds affair might become public. While Vice President John Adams was the leading Federalist candidate for the presidency, Hamilton was worried the opinionated Adams was too unpopular in the South and tacitly supported the candidacy of Thomas Pinckney of South Carolina instead. Adams subsequently won the election from Jefferson by 71 to 68 electoral votes and blamed Hamilton for the narrowness of his victory. Thus, after being the right-hand man for the first president, Hamilton had become completely alienated from the second. The animosity between Hamilton and Adams split the Federalists and strengthened the Republicans, whose leader, Thomas Jefferson, was now vice president. Meanwhile, Hamilton's personal standing was further affected when information about the Reynolds affair finally became public in June 1797. Once again, Hamilton faced claims that his payments to James Reynolds were to facilitate speculation rather than the result of blackmail. In response, he wrote a lengthy pamphlet which admitted the affair with Maria Reynolds in painstaking detail in order to refute the claims of corruption. The pamphlet embarrassed the Federalists and delighted the Republicans, making the former Treasury Secretary the subject of considerable ridicule, but Hamilton's political stature remained largely intact. While the Jay Treaty averted a war with Britain, in 1798 war with France seemed imminent. President Adams sent a three-man delegation to negotiate with France, but Foreign Minister Charles-Maurice Talleyrand sent three minor officials who implied that Talleyrand would not meet them unless given a bribe. When the details reached the United States, the country prepared for war, prompting disagreements between Hamilton and Adams about the need for a standing army. Hamilton was also hoping that he would take command of the army in the imminent war, and when Adams asked Washington to serve as commander-in-chief, the old general agreed on the condition that Hamilton was his second in command, with the rank of Major General. Although Adams was prepared to concede the rank, he favored Henry Knox, the former Secretary of War and Chief of Artillery during the Revolutionary War, as second in command on the basis of seniority, but was eventually forced to back down. Since the 67-year-old Washington was not inclined to take up his duties as commander until war broke out, Hamilton took charge of organizing, equipping, and training the army, and as part of these efforts introduced a bill establishing a military academy at West Point in New York. Hamilton's dreams of military glory were undermined as the fervor for war had diminished, and Washington warned Hamilton that it would be increasingly difficult to find new recruits for the army. In February 1799, Adams decided to send another delegation to come to an agreement with France, a decision which isolated him from Hamilton and the Federalists. A lengthy meeting between Hamilton and Adams in October to discuss the issue ended the relationship between the two men, while the death of Washington on the 14th of December 1799 removed the one man who kept the Federalists united. In November 1799, General Napoleon Bonaparte took power in Paris and declared an end to the French Revolution, weakening Hamilton's warnings about the Jacobin threat. In May 1800, Adams authorized the disbanding of the army, and in July, Hamilton disbanded his headquarters in New York and resigned his military command. Bonaparte was keen to come to an amicable agreement with the United States, and in October 1800, a treaty was signed, avoiding outright war and vindicating Adams' peace initiative. The presidential election of 1800 was set to be a rematch between Adams and Jefferson. Since Adams had defeated Jefferson by 3 votes in the previous election, every vote counted, and attention was drawn to the elections to the New York City legislature in late April, which in turn could determine the fate of New York's electoral votes. New York City was a Federalist stronghold, and Hamilton hoped to keep it that way, while his rival Aaron Burr campaigned to swing the city to the Republicans, hoping that his efforts could make him Jefferson's vice presidential candidate for the national election. Over the years, Hamilton and Burr had many reasons to dislike each other. In the 1790 Senate elections, Burr had defeated Hamilton's father-in-law Philip Schuyler, only for Schuyler to win back his seat in 1796. In 1799, Burr enlisted Hamilton's help in establishing the Manhattan Company, which promised to provide safe drinking water to the city, but added a loophole to enable the company to function as a bank to compete with Hamilton's Bank of New York. By naming political giants and war heroes such as George Clinton and Horatio Gates to his ticket, Burr ensured a clean sweep for the Republicans, which ensured that New York's 12 electoral votes would move from Adams to Jefferson, and the grateful Republicans duly nominated Burr as their vice presidential candidate. Alarmed by the news from New York, in May 1800, Adams dismissed his Secretary of War, James McHenry, and his Secretary of State, Timothy Pickering, both of whom he inherited from Washington's last cabinet and who were close Hamilton supporters. In response, Hamilton sought to persuade Northern Federalists to ditch Adams in favor of Charles Cotesworth Pinckney, the Federalist vice presidential candidate and brother of Thomas Pinckney. In a pamphlet published in October, Hamilton attacked Adams' policies and his character, presenting him as a vengeful man prone to bad temper and mental instability, only to conclude unconvincingly by endorsing both Adams and Pinckney. Like the Reynolds pamphlet, Hamilton's attack on Adams on the eve of a presidential election reflected his poor political judgment when matters of personal honor were at stake. Despite the Federalist infighting, the election produced a close result, with Jefferson and Burr tied on 73 votes and Adams and Pinckney picking up 65 and 64 respectively. Hamilton's pamphlet failed to convince Northern Federalists to withhold their support for Adams, nor did it prevent Republicans from sweeping Pinckney's home state of South Carolina. Hamilton had inflicted a mortal blow to his own political aspirations and crippled the Federalist Party for no gain. While the Republicans considered Jefferson the presidential candidate and Burr the vice presidential candidate, under the constitutional arrangements of the day, there was no distinction, and it was up to the House of Representatives to break the tie. As the Federalists still had a majority in the old House, they considered supporting Burr as the candidate who would be more malleable and be persuaded to adopt Federalist policies. Hamilton, who had first-hand experience of Burr's double-dealing and lack of principles, declared in favor of Jefferson. On the 11th of February 1801, the House met to break the tie in the unfinished Capitol building in the new capital of Washington, D.C. Each of the 16 states had a single vote that represented the majority opinion of each state delegation. For 35 ballots in a row, Burr won 6 states and Jefferson 8, one short of the required majority. In letters to Federalist congressmen, Hamilton argued that Jefferson would be acceptable as president if he maintained the public debt, the Navy, and the Jay Treaty. Although he later denied it, Jefferson appears to have agreed to an informal deal, and when the 36th ballot was cast on the 17th of February, he prevailed with the support of 10 states after several Federalist congressmen withdrew their support from Burr. Thomas Jefferson was sworn in as the 3rd President of the United States on the 4th of March 1801. As Hamilton predicted, although Jefferson had criticized the extent of federal power while in opposition, he was less critical once he was president and had such power at his disposal. When Jefferson asked his Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin to uncover evidence of corruption in Hamilton's Treasury operations, Gallatin reported back stating that Hamilton's system operated perfectly and did not need to be changed. While he dedicated more time to his family and presided over the construction of a country house north of Manhattan which he called the Grange, Hamilton sought to restore the Federalist position in New York by supporting the candidacy of his brother-in-law Stephen Van Rensselaer against the veteran George Clinton for governor in 1801, but failed to prevent Clinton from winning a 7th term. In order to regain their influence in the national debate, Hamilton and his Federalist allies founded a new paper, the New York Evening Post, which would serve as the vehicle for his attacks against Jefferson's government. Within days of the paper's launch, it carried news of a fatal duel on the 23rd of November 1802, which claimed the life of Philip Hamilton, Alexander's eldest son. The death of his son and the political success of the Jeffersonians plunged Hamilton into deep depression, reawakening an interest in religion, which had subsided since the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. He spent most of his time at the Grange, but continued to run his legal practice, where he defended Federalist journalists from Jefferson's attempts to shut their papers down. Jefferson reached the height of his popularity in April 1803 with the Louisiana Purchase, which doubled the size of the United States overnight. Hamilton noted the irony of the Republican president adopting a liberal interpretation of the Constitution by claiming that congressional approval was sufficient to make the land purchase. Although Hamilton had envisaged America's continental future and supported the Louisiana Purchase, many Federalists now argued that Jefferson was acting unconstitutionally, motivated by the fear that the new territory was more reminiscent of the slaveholding agrarian South and that the northern commercial interests would be reduced to a permanent minority. After his attempt to snatch the presidency from Jefferson in 1801, Aaron Burr was excluded from the president's circle and knew that he would not remain on the Republican ticket for the 1804 election. After George Clinton stepped down as governor of New York and later became Jefferson's running mate, Burr decided to run for governor by appealing to Federalists and disaffected Republicans. The Federalist organization in New York was by now so weak that the party could not find a candidate. Although Hamilton decided to support New York Chief Justice Morgan Lewis, the official Republican candidate, most of the Federalists backed Burr. In a bitter election campaign, the Republican press echoed Hamilton's view of Burr as a man with no principles, while anonymous letters appeared offering details of Burr's sexual liaisons. When Burr was soundly defeated in the April 1804 election, he blamed Hamilton, who had already denied him the presidency 3 years before. On the 18th of June, Burr challenged Hamilton to a duel over insulting remarks he had allegedly made about Burr at a dinner 3 months earlier. Although he was opposed to dueling, Hamilton was not a man to shy away when his honor was at stake, and despite attempts by the seconds to avert the showdown and enable both men to back down with honor, on the 27th it was agreed that the two men would fight a pistol duel 2 weeks later. At 7 o'clock in the morning of the 11th of July 1804, Alexander Hamilton and Vice President Aaron Burr faced each other on the dueling ground. In order to reconcile the desire to defend his honor and his desire not to kill, in the days before the duel, Hamilton had decided that he would throw away his shot by deliberately firing wide, knowing that if Burr shot to kill, it would be considered murder and destroy any remaining hopes of resurrecting his political career. While there were conflicting accounts on who fired first, Hamilton's shot flew wide of the mark while Burr dealt Hamilton a mortal blow above the right hip. Hamilton was carried into the mansion of William Bayard, a Bank of New York director, and summoned his family to his bedside. At 2 o'clock on the 12th of July 1804, Alexander Hamilton died from the wound inflicted upon him 31 hours earlier. When Alexander Hamilton was born in Nevis to unmarried parents, it would have been inconceivable for a man of such humble birth to become a statesman and founding father of a new nation. Yet from a young age, he proved himself to be talented and ambitious, enabling him to receive a formal education in North America. Demonstrating his abilities as a persuasive speaker and writer, he embraced the American Revolutionary cause, which would bring him to the side of George Washington in 1777. After serving for 4 years as Washington's indispensable chief of staff, Hamilton claimed military glory at Yorktown alongside his close friends Lafayette and Lawrence. After establishing himself as one of New York's leading lawyers, he played a key role in framing the Constitution of the United States and was its greatest champion during the ratification process. After returning to Washington's side as Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton conceived and implemented a political and economic system of public credit and stock markets which continues to define American capitalism. In the process, he became the most controversial man in the United States, ruthlessly attacked by the Jeffersonians as a monarchist, a traitor to the Revolution in the pay of the British, and a creature of speculators and fraudsters. Hamilton's uncompromising views and sense of honor created a number of rivals in the form of George Clinton and Aaron Burr at the state level and John Adams and Thomas Jefferson at the federal level. His fateful intervention in delivering the presidency to his arch-nemesis Jefferson in 1801 sowed the seeds for the fatal confrontation with Burr in 1804. Despite his often crucial role in the early years of the United States, in comparison to the other founding fathers, Hamilton has received relatively little attention. The subject of a stage play in 1917 and a film in 1931, it was the multi-award-winning 2015 musical which has brought him once again into the spotlight. Ironically, a plan to put Alexander Hamilton on a US banknote, the very currency he helped to create, was shelved due to the popularity of the musical. What do you think of Alexander Hamilton? Was he a great statesman whose political and economic system laid the foundations of American greatness in the later 19th and 20th centuries, creating the economic and military power which has kept the nation safe from foreign enemies over the centuries? Or did he betray the ideals of the American Revolution by levying taxes and championing closer trade relations with the British Empire? Please let us know in the comments section. And in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.